You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 14th of February 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program, Donald Trump announces a fresh round of tariffs and singles out the European Union. We'll look at how Brussels will respond. Then, as the Munich Security Conference gets underway in earnest, we'll speak to Monocle's Andrew Muller about Ukraine, Russia, and how everyone is dealing with the US officials in town.
Everyone knows what the nightmare scenario is, that if Russia feels like it is no longer pinned down in Ukraine, if it can menace other states, whether it just builds up on their borders or actually walks across them.
After that, we look at why Norwegians have placed a bounty on salmon. Yes, you heard that right. We'll get an update on South Korean President Yoon's impeachment trial, and then...
These are things that we come into contact with every day. We're washing our hands constantly. We're using the bathroom, hopefully less constantly. So it's really important that they're well considered. And that's what this whole exercise has been about.
Monocle's Nick Muniz at a bathroom design day in Barcelona. And Monocle's Laura Kramer with me here in studio for Valentine's Day. All that right here on a packed Friday briefing with me, Chris Chermak. Donald Trump's announcements on everything from Ukraine to the Middle East and Gaza have dominated the news cycle in the past few weeks, and all the while there has been the rumbling around trade tariffs. The U.S. president yesterday announced a plan to impose reciprocal tariffs on every country that punishes U.S. exports in some way. Trump also singled out the European Union for being, quote, absolutely brutal in its treatment of the United States. The European Union has vowed to fight back, and joining me now to talk about what all this could mean is Kim Mackrell, reporter for the Wall Street Journal in Brussels. Kim, great to have you on the show. These reciprocal tariffs have not been fully laid out yet, but how much do we know at this point about the impact they could have?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. So what we know so far is largely related to what President Trump said yesterday, the content of the memo that the U.S. published, and you know what the White House has said so far. And we do have some hints when it comes to the European Union. So first of all, even before all of this, we've heard lots of concerns from U.S. officials and from Donald Trump, from President Trump, about the difference in car tariffs. So the EU has a 10% tariff on car imports, where the U.S.'s import tariff is 2.5%. So that difference has been singled out in the past, including during Trump's first administration, and it's something that we know they're concerned about again. So that's one aspect, but from the communications yesterday, we also have a sense of a couple of other issues that might be particular concerns for the U.S. when it comes to the EU. One of those is the EU's or European countries' value-added taxes. So there's a signal that could be a concern for the Trump administration. Some digital services taxes that certain member states in the EU have put, which they've applied that to certain digital services, certain companies that meet particular revenue thresholds. So that's another one. And then there was a hint that there could be some response to the level of European regulation that affects U.S. companies, and I think what they're likely getting at here is regulations that some big U.S. tech companies have complained about, such as the European Union's Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, which both have some pretty strict new rules for that affect large tech companies when it comes to online content and also in digital competition.
So, Kim, you've laid out there the kind of laundry list of complaints that the Trump administration has about taxes in the European Union. What do you expect the European Union is going to do with all of that? Are they going to reduce some of these taxes, or are they going to fight back with tariffs of their own?
Right. It's a great question. And I would say, just first of all, the EU has been quite careful in what it says publicly about what its options are. We know they've looked at They've been aware that some of these issues are going to come up under a Trump administration. They've been aware of that for some time and have done a lot of preparation work for that. We know they've examined a lot of different potential responses. Broadly speaking, they think about this in the sense of there are carrots and there are sticks in how to respond to U.S. trade concerns. Carrots being and we know generally they think that potentially they could offer to buy more liquefied natural gas from the U.S., more military defense-related purchases from the U.S. We know there has been some discussion around the possibility of lowering the tariff on car imports. That could be something that could be discussed as part of a carrot approach. On the other hand, they also talk about the idea of having retaliation if they feel they need to. There are a couple of different ways that could be done. In the past, they've gone after specific U.S. products, and you might remember there were some specific U.S. products that were targeted back in 2018 under the first Trump administration, like bourbon whiskey from Kentucky, Florida orange juice, Levi's jeans, Harley-Davidson motorcycles. So we could see them turn to something like that again in terms of retaliation. But it is unfortunately we know they repeatedly say their top priority is coming to some sort of deal that can work for both sides, and certainly I think that's what you would expect them to want to do, because that relationship is so valuable to Europe. But they do say they have those retaliation options available.
They certainly will want to reach a deal. But just finally, Kim, I mean, similar to Canada, frankly, on this, another country that would have wanted to reach a deal with the United States and maybe still will, but in the meantime has been pretty angry with Trump's responses. Do you get any sense of that mood in Brussels? Could there be a move here, to buy European, to kind of launch this campaign to say, we don't need the U.S. You should buy goods here in Europe instead?
That's a great question. I think what it could say is that we know European trade ministers met this week to talk about transatlantic relations and what's been going on with the U.S. and the feeling out of that meeting was quite strongly that there was support for the idea of retaliation if it's necessary. And of course, negotiation first, which is important because any action they take, they're going to have some level of support from the individual member states. As far as a bigger buy European movement, I don't think I've seen a strong evidence of shifting in that direction yet. But what you do see is a lot of push by the European Commission to try to strengthen its trade relationships with other countries, other trading partners. So they spoke with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau this week. There will be European officials going to India later this month. They signed a deal with Mexico. They signed a recent deal also with South American countries. So there's a lot of movement to try to say and at least signal that maybe the trading relationship, as important as it is with the U.S., it's not the only relationship there for Europe.
The European Union diversifying its trade options. Thanks very much to Kim. That was Kim Mackerel of the Wall Street Journal in Brussels. And now here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. U.S. President Donald Trump says he will meet with the leaders of China and Russia to discuss cutting their military budgets in half. Mr. Trump says the U.S. doesn't need more nuclear weapons, as its current arsenal could destroy the world 100 times over. A Russian drone has damaged a radiation shelter at Chernobyl's nuclear power plant. Authorities say there was no radiation leak or increased danger following the incident. The shelter protects against radiation from the 1986 reactor explosion. Ukraine says Russia launched more than 100 drones overnight, with dozens shot down by air defenses. And the South Korean budget airliner EasterJet is under fire after crew members took selfies on a plane wing. The staff opened an emergency exit to pose for photos during a snow delay at Cheongju Airport, where photography is banned without military approval. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Laura. We'll hear more from Laura a little later on in the show. But now, the Munich Security Conference is well underway with a series of U.S. officials on hand to give everyone else plenty to talk about. Mostly, of course, related to the future of Ukraine and European defense. Our own team, following all the ups and downs in Munich this week, includes Monocle's own Andrew Muller, host of the Foreign Desk podcast. Andrew, you've been to the Munich Security Conference the last few years. Is it fair to say there's a bit of extra tension in the air this time around?
It's fair to say there's a lot of extra tension in the air this time around. The last couple of years, for all the concerns that there were about Ukraine, Gaza and other things, there was still the sense that the Munich Security Conference was the big annual celebration of the transatlantic alliance, and, you know, how absolutely marvelous it was, and everybody was able to go home from it feeling somewhat reassured that we were all still basically on the same side. As you insinuate, the big theme of this year's Munich Security Conference is everybody frantically trying to figure out if that's still true.
And Andrew, what do we know about the possibility of U.S. and Russian officials meeting there? Because that, of course, is also at the center of this question of whether there is still an alliance and a meeting of minds between the U.S. and Europe.
It's unclear yet exactly what is happening, and there are various stories emerging all the time about people's schedules changing and not changing. There's sort of a certain amount of breathless excitement was occasioned not long ago by the news that Vice President J.D. Vance's meeting with President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine has been postponed, but I think we can probably assume that one is going to happen in due course. At this very early stage, I mean, this really is the first morning of the conference proper. We are still very much at the nobody knows anything point. But yeah, there would be, I think, a lot of disquiet among the United States European allies, especially those who live closer to Russia, at the idea of any direct contact at all.
Now, Volodymyr Zelensky has been holding a news conference himself, even if he wasn't able to meet J.D. Vance just yet. He would be the main event in any previous year, but do you get the sense that he and the Ukrainians have been kind of put on the back foot by all of this?
A little bit. I mean, they are still key to the major drama hanging over this conference, or the major question hanging over this conference, because it is that thing of, does the United States propose at some level or another to usher Ukraine under the bus in the interests of getting this war ended at absolutely any cost? And for a lot of the attendees here, this is not an academic proposition. We have just literally in the last few minutes been speaking to Latvia's Minister of Defense, who, while being very sort of upbeat and positive about everything, you know, you do understand that for a country like Latvia, this is not an academic proposition, because everyone knows what the nightmare scenario is, that if Russia feels like it is no longer pinned down in Ukraine, if it can redeploy those tens of thousands of troops to other frontiers, if it can menace other states, whether it just builds up on their borders or actually walks across them. But that's, I think, what concerns everybody who is still concerned about this, that you have a situation in which Russia bites off of, you know, a tiny chunk of a country like Estonia or Latvia, and then stands back to see how serious anybody really is about Article 5 of the NATO treaty.
Andrew, just finally, who else are you excited particularly to speak with over this weekend, and how do you expect them to process all of this news coming out over the last few days?
I think there's probably likely to be a difference between what they'll tell us about how they're processing it and how they're actually processing it. But we are, as usual, aiming for a mix of current office holders and former office holders. The former office holders, though no longer being in office, tend to be much likely to tell you what they actually think. I can tell you, And it gives also some illustration of what kind of a madhouse this event can become. I think our next two up to the gate are Alexei Reznikov, the former defense minister of Ukraine, who is, of course, a repeat customer of the Foreign Desk. And then I think shortly after that, we have the president of Estonia. And really, I haven't started thinking properly about this afternoon after lunch yet.
Well, we'll let you get back to thinking what you can have for lunch and what you're going to do with your guests after that. Andrew Muller, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak. If you've ever considered yourself a hunter of salmon, this might be your lucky day, because in Norway, the world's largest farmed salmon producer is offering a reward of 500 kroner, around 43 euros, for every salmon caught after more than 27,000 of them escaped from a farm in northwestern Norway. Joining us for more on this very developing story is Lars Bevenger, Monocle's Oslo correspondent. Lars, how many salmon have you caught so far?
Well, I haven't caught any, and not many people have so far. Well, the last figures we have was from yesterday evening, and about 24 out of the 27,000 had been caught. Now, most of these had been caught by fishermen that the salmon company, Moe, hire, and 5 of the salmon were caught by individuals who will be able to claim that reward. So it's not going particularly well.
That really is not going well, one has to be honest. 24 out of 27,000. Take us back to how exactly this escape act happened. This farm lost a quarter of its salmon population.
Yeah, so salmon farms in Norway are all open pens. So basically the salmon are swimming around in a giant net. What happened this time, it seems, is that bad weather caused damage to one of these or several of these pens, and the salmon escaped. Now, this is a massive problem, not just in terms of a loss of revenue for the company. The salmon that escape might carry disease and infect the wild salmon population, but more importantly is that they will interbreed with the wild salmon, and when they do, they ruin the gene pool of the wild salmon, and they become less resilient to disease and spawn less easily as well. So we see massive reductions in wild salmon in Norway, and this is mainly caused by escaped farm salmon.
So you talk about some of the disease and the serious aspects there. Also, just talk about the business element a little bit. How big a company is Moe, and how big is salmon fishing in Norway?
Well, Moe is by far the world's largest salmon producer, and fish farming is huge in Norway. For example, Norway's richest man is a guy who's 31 years old called Gustav Witzøe, and he's the heir of another fish farming giant called Salma. He's worth an estimated $2.7 billion. And the total export last year was 1.2 million tons of salmon, which was valued about 11 billion euro. So it is a huge industry. It's also very important for local communities up and down the coast of Norway, smaller communities that otherwise would probably not have the right to live, if you want to put it that way, because the salmon pens are spread out over the whole of Norway's coastline and provide income and work to a lot of people who live there.
Just finally, Lars, 24 out of 27,000 caught. Do we expect that number to pick up? Are there more things that Moe and Norwegians can do?
They expect more to be caught, but if we look at historic escapes, they don't often catch very many. There were the worst year of escapes was in 2019, when 290,000 salmon escaped, and only about 5% of those were caught again.
Lars Bevenger in Oslo, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. South Korea's ousted president Yoon Suk Yeol faced an impeachment hearing that could be his last yesterday. Seoul's constitutional court will now decide whether the president deserves to be formally impeached for imposing martial law towards the end of last year. And here to tell us more is Robert E. Kelly, professor of political science at Pusan National University. Robert, how did this last impeachment hearing go?
Yeah, I think that he's probably going to be removed. I think the court has done a pretty good job on this. They've had experience. There was an impeachment 8 years ago where the court also did, I think, really good due diligence. And I think that's happened again. But I think the big problem is that for all the street protests and whatever, right? It's actually the whole thing, unraveled or sort of took place on television. Everybody watched it, right? I mean, everybody saw soldiers busting windows on the Parliament building and opposition MPs climbing over the fences and stuff like that. I think it's the evidence is just so obvious that I think he's going to be removed.
Robert, how has President Yoon gone about justifying his martial law declaration last year in these hearings?
Yeah, I think he's really struggled with this. I mean, this is actually something I've noted in my writing, too, that he's never really explained why divided government, which is a term we use in political science to mean when the legislature is controlled by one party and the executive is controlled by another, and you get a kind of gridlock, right? He's never explained why divided government required overthrowing the Constitution, because divided government is, in fact, quite common in democracies. It happens in lots and lots of democracies, right? You get multiple elections and the parties don't agree, and then you get sort of stalemate and muddling through and all kinds of compromises that nobody likes. And, that's happened in Korea before, too. And I don't think the president ever really explained why this fairly common constitutional happenstance in other democracies required suspending constitutional government in South Korea. And I think part of that is because Yoon himself was not a politician, right? He'd never had elected office before. He came into the office almost sort of as a fluke, and kind of like Donald Trump, actually. And I don't think he fully understands the parameters of the office and fully grasps that there are limits. Just because he's president doesn't mean he can do whatever he wants. And this is sort of a running problem in South Korea's history, that the presidency is kind of like a monarchy and presidents get in trouble for overreaching and stuff like that.
Well, I mean, and whether he understands the ramifications or not, what do you think this does mean, though, for South Korea's democracy? Because he does have his supporters. So if he is going to attack something like divided government, there are going to be people that are going to buy into that.
Yeah, and they did, which is actually pretty shocking. No, that's actually a great question. I think that was actually one of the reasons why this really kind of took South Koreans aback. I mean, it sort of resulted in this huge explosion of sort of, public opinion and protests, and people were so upset. I mean, he was impeached. The first step of the impeachment was hit within, I think, like a week, like 8 days after he did this. I mean, the move against it was really, really fast, because everybody in Korea, where I live, was like, oh, my God, what is this? Right? I mean, this is the kind of thing we expect from dictators. We haven't had a dictator in 45 years. And so I think, that is why he sort of ran into this enormous wall of resistance, right? And then, as you mentioned, right, there's also been sort of these people who've come forward and really defended him, and it's gotten really kind of hairy on the streets and stuff like that. And I wonder if when he's removed, when most likely is removed, how will the hard right in South Korea, Yoon is a conservative, how will the hard right that people have really demonstrated for him, how will they respond? Again, I mean, if you look at the way, you've had challenges to democracy in the West, most obviously Donald Trump, right? The response wasn't good when Trump lost in 2020. His supporters stormed Congress. And there's been a lot of that kind of like behavior here, including very similar language. South Korean protesters in support of Yoon have waved stop the steal signs, just like in the United States. And I wonder, to your question, right, will they simply reject this, right? I mean, will they, I don't know, try to block the prison where he'll be sent or something like that?
Well, and just finally then on that point, Robert, I mean, if the Constitutional Court does impeach him or back the impeachment as you expect, right, where does this go from there, particularly for Yoon himself? I mean, is there a chance that he could still, a la Trump, make some kind of comeback, or that an ally of his could make a comeback down the line?
Yeah, for himself, so my guess is that he will. The impeachment, which was levied by the legislature, will be ratified or confirmed by the court. That's how the process works. It's sort of a two-step process. They could find in his favor, in which case he would be returned to the presidency. That happened in an impeachment in 2004. That probably won't happen this time because, as we said, it took place right there on national television. The whole country saw him basically try to overthrow the government. So I think he's gone. I think he's out. And then he'll probably wind up in prison. I would imagine, to your questions, that I think he may actually see protesters lining the streets and stuff like that. There may actually be prison to protest in front of the prison or something like that. But I mean, if he goes to jail, barring some kind of right-wing street explosion, which I don't think will happen, but I mean, I suppose it could. I think he will wind up in prison. And then you get an election. There has to be an election, I believe, within 3 months, the Constitution requires, of a completed impeachment. So that would be by like June, I guess, right? It's May. And since Yoon is a conservative, my guess is it will be a landslide victory for the South Korean left. That's how I see this in the next 4 or 5 months.
Robert E. Kelly, thank you very much for joining us from South Korea. This is The Briefing. Time now for a glimpse into the world of design, because Monocle's design editor Nick Muniz joins us now from Barcelona, where the Spanish bathroom designer Roca is unveiling a series of new product launches. And Nick, you're going to make bathroom product launches sexy for us, mostly, if I understand, because of the way that Roca goes about launching them.
Yeah, truly. This was not a turn I expected right now. How to make bathrooms sexy? Well, I think bathrooms can be inherently sexy. I don't know. Maybe let's not go into that. No. So I'm here in Barcelona, for an event called Design Day, hosted by Roca, the Spanish bathroom brand, as you said. And it's just kind of a moment to gather the design community outside the typical trade fairs. That's why I kind of like coming here for this. But yes, they're launching a host of new wares, which they presented over recent days. We've got an amazing new collection by and Sarah, a brilliant Barcelona designer. Stefan Dietz, an amazing German designer, unveiled a new tap. But which maybe doesn't sound that enticing, but it is nice. These are things that we come into contact with every day. We're washing our hands constantly. We're using the bathroom, hopefully less constantly. We're hopefully you're regular. These sorts of things. You're coming into contact with them regularly. So it's really important that they're well considered, and that's what this whole exercise has been about. But equally, hosting it as a design day, it's also more of a festival atmosphere, and looking at the bathroom in the context of our homes and cities more broadly.
Well, Nick, I'm sorry to have thrown you into trying to make bathroom design sexy there, but tell me more about this design day in general, because it is interesting that Roca involves the entire Barcelona design community in this. Yeah,
so and I think maybe that's also a strength of Barcelona, perhaps as maybe a little bit more of an unsung design capital. Obviously we're looking at this very famous Catalonian bathroom brand, but equally we visited the Fundació Miro, which is this amazing space dedicated to the artist Miro and all of his work. We've also, the traffic noise you can hear in the background is me sitting outside Ricardo Bofill, his studio, his architecture studio. We've just done a tour of that. A very famous Barcelona-based designer. He passed away a few years ago, but his son's now running the practice. So we've just done a tour of that. A tour of Walden 7, which is another amazing building, a social housing complex in Barcelona that was built to really idealistic values. So we're also equally, immersing ourselves in these spaces. And I think it's really an important way to talk and to look at design, because it's that whole thing where, a faucet's on a basin, which is in a bathroom, which is in a home, which is on a street, which is in a city. And I think that's really the narrative that we're kind of looking at here. We're looking at the interconnectedness of everyday objects and our day-to-day lives and the broader community.
Just finally, Nick, where can we expect the results of all your visits there? Monocle on Design podcast, the magazine?
A little bit of both, and we're also going to be here later in the year for our Quality of Life conference in Barcelona, and we, maybe there's a world where we end up at Ricardo Bofill's office for a drink, or the Miro Foundation for maybe a little bit of a late night boogie if we can secure some exclusive access. So we're going to be in Barcelona a lot over the coming months.
Lots of networking going on. Nick Muniz, Monocle's design editor, thank you very much for joining us. This is The Briefing. And finally, on today's show, Monocle's Laura Kramer is here to close out the week. Happy Valentine's Day, Laura.
Happy Valentine's Day, Chris.
I understand you have some plans, both for yourself today and for our listeners.
Yeah, that's right. Well, for myself, I'm actually taking it easy. I've had a really big week, Chris. I'm going to have to tell you about a party I went to. But for listeners, if they don't have plans yet, they can book a really nice experience. Now, I hinted about this, about my big plans. Earlier this week, I went to the launch of the exciting culinary Oscars party that's going to be happening. Okay, so let me tell you. Are you ready for this?
Do tell. I am ready for the party. And then you have to get back to how the listeners can get involved in it.
Don't you worry. We will wrap it all up really nicely for you. So I went to this party at 45 Park Lane. It's a hotel in London, in Mayfair.
Swanky.
Very swanky. I walked in and Chef Elliot Grover said to me, Laura, thank God you're here. We have 300 bottles of champagne to get through. It's like he knew his crowd. He knew I could get it.
You absolutely had to do your best to get through as many as possible. You have to do your duty in these situations.
Absolutely. I have to. Now, the great thing about Chef Elliot, he is the culinary director at 45 Park Lane, and he's going to be working at the Oscars again, feeding the stars alongside Wolfgang Puck. It's his third year doing it. Wolfgang has been doing it for decades. He is probably 30-something years more.
He's an institution. That's
right. But Elliot is bringing an English culinary flair to it, so the stars will get to try some favorites that we have here in the UK, including Toad in the Hole. It was my first time trying that. Fish and chips and beef Wellington. And the way that they are all crafted, they're very small because obviously you don't want to get sauces and everything on the very nice clothing. And so it's made so that it's kind of easy to eat in one hand, ready to go. And then off you go to accept your Academy Award. What
were your thoughts, Laura? Are the stars going to be impressed by this British cooking?
Well, I think so because Elliot was invited now for the third time to bring it back. I think they're going to love it. But it was a really exciting event. And now back to how listeners can
benefit from
benefit. Yeah, so actually at the bar there, Bar 45, they will be having this menu and people can actually enjoy it themselves. They can purchase it and see what it's all about. British comfort food is what I called it, served with Hollywood style, definitely. And there's really actually a very nice, it's dining with a cause, I would say, because the proceeds also go to the Motion Picture and Television Fund's Wildfire Relief Fund. So it supports the entertainment industry workers affected by the wildfires that happened in Los Angeles.
Dining with a cause, eating like the stars. This is the perfect Valentine's Day option for anyone out there still looking for plans. Laura Kramer, thank you very much for joining us. And that is all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Tom Webb. Our researcher was Maisie Ringer. And our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. The Briefing is back on Monday at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Have a good weekend, everybody, and thanks for listening.